It's not a scientific talk unless at least one person says it depends, right? I've been asking for the answer my entire career, and I never get the answer. I always get, it depends. That's okay, though. The world is messy. And the world is messy because humans are in it, and that's what our next speaker is going to talk about, is how humans interact with their landscapes and can actually be landscape modifiers. I've seen that on a lot of different things over time, and that's what Michelle Steen Adams is going to talk to you about. It's sort of a framework for thinking about that human interaction. So help me welcome Michelle Steen Adams.
All right. Well, thank you all for attending today. I want to say thank you to Cheryl and to all of you for your interest in this topic. By way of introduction, I just want to say that I'm affiliated with the Pacific Northwest Research Station in the Portland lab. This affiliation began in 2012 as a visiting scientist during a sabbatical year, and subsequently as a contractor. And my connection to this topic, human dimensions of landscape ecology, first began during my graduate work. Through a joint PhD program, I undertook interdisciplinary training in the fields of landscape ecology, environmental history, and associated forest social sciences. And so in developing today's talk for you, I drew on this interdisciplinary training. I hope it's relevant to your work. So the key question that guides this talk is, what approaches can be employed to integrate socio-cultural processes into a landscape ecology framework to NEPA decision-making? In keeping with today's talk, this question is designed to promote the target outcome of strengthening NEPA decisions. So I'll begin by recognizing a challenge of integrating human dimensions into a landscape ecology framework. And that's this: it may not be very clear where human dimensions fit into the analysis. And so to address this challenge, I'm going to use the landscape analysis and design framework as a reference point. I'll draw some connection points to this framework. Some of you might be familiar with this framework. It was developed in 1992 by Diaz and Apostle on the Mount Hood and Gifford Pinchot National Forests. So because this is about 20 years old, I'll just do a quick review of this framework. Excuse me. So I'm going to emphasize connection points to the landscape analysis part of this framework. That's the upper part of the framework. And this analysis involves 5 steps or elements. 1, landscape structure, that is patches, corridors, and matrix. 2, landscape flows, i.e. characterizing the organisms, humans or other animals, and matter, say water and nutrients, that move through the landscapes. 3, interactions between landscape structure and landscape flows. 4, natural disturbances and succession. And 5, linkages between the project area and its broader landscape context. So, despite the fact that this LAD framework is about 20 years old, I hope that you can still draw connections between these fundamental framework elements and the framework that you're using currently. So it's also important to recognize some of the inherent challenges to incorporating human dimensions into landscape analysis, given the state of our landscape ecology science. So in the US, the very first landscape ecology symposium took place at the University of Georgia in 1986. And since then, a limitation that has been recognized is really the paucity of social and cultural tools and elements. For example, in 2010, the Society's president, Jack Wu, he wrote an editorial and he challenged the field's members to address these knowledge gaps. He said, in general, landscape ecologists have paid a lot more attention to the biophysical than cultural aspects of landscapes. And in response, Jack Wu observed, we need more attention to the cultural landscape. And this is important because human actions, which are strongly influenced by culture, have a tremendous influence on landscape structure and function. For instance, an interesting fact is that humans now appropriate about 1/4, 24% of the net primary production. So we're a huge influence on ecosystem processes and function. Similarly, a 2003 publication by Don Field, Volker Radloff, and others argued that landscape analysis needs more attention to the human actor. All right, so the main message of today's talk is really pointed to by this slide. What I want to do here is demonstrate 3 different approaches that you might use to integrate human dimensions into a landscape ecology framework. So one approach that I'll demonstrate is a cultural landscape analysis, and I'll exemplify that by focusing on the cultural fire regime using some research that our team did in the East Side Cascades of Oregon. A second approach is a multi-level analysis, and I'll apply that to a heritage feature, that of the Santiam Wagon Road on the Willamette National Forest. And the third approach is something called a social landscape analysis. And I'll apply that to social influences on the adoption of restoration practices, specifically using beaver-related restoration in 2 places, one in the Okanagan Highlands in northern Washington, and 2 in Northern California. All right, so let's talk about cultural landscape analysis. That's one approach that you could use to integrate human dimensions into a landscape analysis. So the central idea of cultural landscape analysis is really to gain insight into the cultural processes that historically influenced and maintained landscape structure and function. For instance, in southern Portugal, there's a landscape called the Montado, and this is an interesting landscape type. It has developed through centuries of silvicultural, agricultural, and pastoral activities in this landscape. And it's those centuries of activity that account for the relatively sparse tree cover, about 20 trees per hectare, and the quite improved agricultural pasture. And so if the goal is to maintain or perhaps restore these conditions, then it's important to maintain, or if necessary, restore these cultural practices. All right, so I want to then apply this cultural landscape analysis approach to a study that my team conducted on the east side of the Cascades of Oregon. And we asked 2 questions. One is, what was the traditional knowledge of fire use by the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs peoples? And 2, how did the Warm Springs peoples traditionally use fire in the moist mixed conifer zone in green, the dry mixed conifer zone in yellow, and the shrub grassland zones, and thereby maintain cultural fire regimes? So you may be wondering, what is a cultural fire regime? So the answer to that is that it's a group's pattern of managing fuels and ignitions of a particular ecological community to promote desired resources and ecological conditions. That is to say that the traditional knowledge, the specific culture, its seasonal round, and the practices that are associated with promoting desired culturally important species in turn influence the particular way of manipulating fuels and ignitions, and that in turn influences the historical fire regime. So just a word about materials and methods. We used a combination of data sets. 1, ethno-historical records. 2 oral history interviews and participatory GIS data, and 3 historical ecological records. And I just want to acknowledge the trust of the tribal communities in trusting to us their traditional knowledge. That was something that really took many, many conversations to identify, to come to agreement about what kinds of traditional knowledge are appropriate to share and what kinds are maybe not so appropriate to share because of the sacred nature of this knowledge. So a couple of results that I want to share with you. One is that the Warm Springs tribes developed traditional knowledge to promote distinct culturally important species in each of these 3 zones, the moist mixed conifer, the dry mixed conifer, and the shrub grassland zones. And I just want to highlight that, in a community context, these culturally important resources are more than biological entities alone. These are resources that really sustain the tribal community's culture over the generations. And secondly, the evidence enabled us to characterize the cultural fire regime in the moist mixed conifer zone. And what we learned is that the tribal peoples, the Warm Springs tribes, applied low severity fire on an as-needed basis, moving in a rotational pattern around this moist mixed conifer zone, specifically the areas where big leaf huckleberry shrubs grew. We learned that the patch size was relatively small, about 1 to 4 hectares, but it's interesting to note that the spatial extent was quite large. About 24 different harvesting sites were noted, and those were distributed over 2 mountains, Mount Hood and Mount Jefferson, and many buttes. So we identified several restoration applications, and I'll just briefly note them. One is application to restoration of big leaf huckleberry. 2 is the engagement of the tribal communities in applying this traditional knowledge, both to restore culturally important species as well as forests. And 3 is landscape level, a cross-ownership approach to forest management. So coming back to the landscape analysis and design framework. So how can a cultural landscape analysis approach be applied? So what I would suggest is that you might think about applying a cultural processes component to the historical fire regime. And in so doing, that has a couple of applications. One is that gives us insight into the historical landscape structure. For instance, the patch size of those huckleberry harvest resource sites. And 2, it gives us information pointing us to culturally important species that might be important from a management perspective. Okay, so second, I want to just briefly highlight a different approach, that of multi-level analysis. So this is, of course, a fundamental idea of landscape ecology, and it's traditionally been applied to biophysical systems. But I want to show how this can also be applied to a heritage resource. The core idea of multi-level analysis is that to understand any phenomenon or management issue, it's critical to employ 3 different levels. First, there's the focal level, and that's the appropriate or assigned level to examine a particular phenomenon of interest. So hypothetically, we might ask, well, what is the effect of tree stand density on avian diversity? And then there's the underlying mechanismal level, where you look at the specific components that in turn drive that phenomenon of interest. So for the bird species example, or I'm sorry, avian diversity example, we might identify nesting sites and foraging sites. And then third, there's the landscape level. This is the upper level that assigns constraints, such as topography or climate, on the area where this phenomenon could potentially occur. So an example application of multi-level analysis is to the Santiam-Wagon Road. And this is a special interest area of the Santiam Pass Summer Motorized Recreation Project environmental analysis on the Willamette National Forest. And for this special interest area, there's a need to rehabilitate motorized vehicle impacts to this important heritage feature and to protect it from future uses. So there are multiple potentially competing use considerations. One, there's the off-highway vehicles, and this is a type of use that's steadily increased in the area over the past decade. And of course, this is of particular consequence to the state of this heritage resource. And secondly, there are the non-motorized uses. Heritage resource considerations exist at two historical periods. One, there's the historic or Euro-American settlement era. Constructed in the 1860s, this Santiam-Wagon Road was one of the first trans-Cascade roads. And it was significant because Willamette Valley settlers gained access to the grasslands of Central Oregon through this road. And then secondly, during the prehistoric or pre-Euro-American settlement era, this corridor was an important trail for tribal groups, probably the Molalla tribes. So how might a multi-level analysis approach be applied to the Santiam-Wagon Road? So here's one scenario. So first, there's analysis at the middle or focal level, such as the Santiam-Wagon Road within the Willamette National Forest. And in keeping with this EA's analysis, this level would highlight the trail's significance as a corridor that provided Willamette Valley settlers access to the bunchgrass range in Central Oregon for their horses and cattle. And ultimately, it made possible the settlement of Central Oregon. In addition, the focal level highlights the trail's origin as a tribal pathway and its importance, and the importance of this trail probably to the Molalla tribes to access plant and animal resources. But then secondly, there's analysis at the site level, and this underlying level focuses on the specific sites where events occurred that contributed to the Santiam-Wagon Road's overall cultural and economic function. For instance, as depicted in this image, sites where tolls were collected and sites where settlers camped. And this fine-grained level is important because it embodies place-specific stories that anchor the trail's overall importance. At the time of project implementation, these sites can be valuable for interpretation. And then third is analysis at the landscape level. This level provides geographical context. For instance, there's the broader regional context significance of establishing transportation and, in turn, economic interconnections between the Willamette Valley, the Cascade Range, and Central Oregon. So in sum, a multi-level analysis presents a framework to understand the significance of this heritage resource that might not be apparent at the NEPA project level alone. Okay, so third, I want to demonstrate the application of social landscape analysis. And the objective here is to expand the scope of landscape ecology to focus on, or to characterize, I should say, social organizational structure, human behavior, and social relations to the land. As a person who spent my graduate years in the upper Midwest, I find that the origin of this social landscape analysis to be quite interesting, and I hope you do too. So it's based in rural sociology of the upper Midwest in the 1930s, and during that time, soil erosion had become a major agricultural issue. So rural sociologists sought to understand the demographic, agricultural, economic, and geographical factors that influenced farmers' receptivity to adoption of soil conservation practices, specifically that of applying or using contour plowing. And so overall, this approach aims to shed light on the social factors that explain human behavior. Okay. So this approach can potentially be applied to expanding understanding of landowner willingness to adopt wetland restoration practices. And I'm going to use two examples very briefly. So one example that did not use a social landscape analysis due to the lack of explanatory need given that particular social context. And secondly, an example that did use elements of social landscape analysis. So the first example is depicted here. This is the Triple Creek project in the Okanagan Highlands. The situation here is that in the 1990s, the stream had become severely incised. And by 2010, the riparian vegetation was greatly simplified, and the thriving great blue heron rookery was extirpated. The social context is one that involved self-selected willing participants. These are land stewards who had invested in 500 acres of wetland together, and they were motivated to implement wetland restoration approaches. So a potential solution to wetland degradation is beaver-related restoration. This means the use of beavers or artificial structures that mimic beaver dams in restoration practice. And so the Triple Creek project, a collaborative endeavor, employed beaver-related restoration. In 2016-2017, volunteers installed 26 beaver dam analogs. These are structures, again, that mimic the flooding function of beaver dams. In time, the beavers returned, and the project streams are now becoming much more connected to the floodplain, benefiting both the plants and wildlife. Okay, by contrast, here is research in the Scott River Basin in California. And here, most of the beaver dam analog sites are on working private lands. The social context involves ranchers who own much of the private land. And these landowners often carefully weigh the benefits versus costs of prospective beaver reintroduction. For instance, the beaver dams might make water more available for irrigation and increase forage production. But on the other hand, the beavers can plug irrigation infrastructure and eat alfalfa. So this project demonstrates aspects of a social landscape analysis. Here, landowners have a complex calculus to determine whether or not to adopt beaver-related restoration practices. And specifically, social science techniques were employed to identify the enabling factors for landowners to adopt beaver-related restoration practices. And so 3 of the factors that I'll just briefly highlight is the presence of partnerships, to the appropriateness of applying compatible grazing management, and 3, a supportive regulatory environment. So overall, the Scott River Basin, one of 6 different study sites, was one of 6 different case study sites. In short, the investigators found that these enabling factors were common across sites, suggesting that they're important for promoting successful beaver-related restoration projects elsewhere. So I want to bring this back around to the LAD framework. How can a social landscape analysis approach be applied to this framework? Well, one way to do so would be to add an additional component, a social drivers component. For instance, characterization of the enabling factors, which I just mentioned, of a particular restoration behavior. And this factor can provide, insight into most of the LAD framework elements. For example, the presence and abundance of wildlife, like the beaver populations, landscape structure, disturbance regimes, such as overbank flooding to promote wetland restoration. So, in summary, human dimensions can be integrated into a LAD framework using several approaches. One, a cultural landscape analysis approach. This can give insight into the cultural practices that maintained historical structure and function and culturally important species, and it can suggest restoration strategies. For heritage resources, a multi-level approach can expand understanding of the resource at two levels, the site-specific level, and that can provide insight into particular places, people, and stories that anchor the resource's local significance and function, and two, at the upper level, the landscape or regional context level. And then a third approach is social landscape analysis. And this can provide insight into the social drivers that influence stakeholder behavior and in turn, LAD framework factors. So in sum, with targeted modifications, a LAD framework can accommodate the integration of sociocultural practices at a landscape scale, thereby promoting strong NEPA decisions. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge the groups that contributed to this presentation, as well as funders of our research study. And for those who would like more details about the content of this talk, here are some of our key references. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for your time.